I'm Leah Small, and this is Virginia Voices, where you will hear first-person stories from people most affected by current politics, policy, and economic trends. We give Virginians outside the news a full stage to explore their thoughts and experiences beyond a few sound bites or paragraphs in a daily news story. Virginia Voices is a project of the Virginia Center for Investigative Journalism at WHRO. Matthan Wilson teaches government and African American history at a high school in Newport News. Wilson and educators are at the center of a political firestorm surrounding teaching about race in classrooms in Virginia and nationally. Virginia is one of 18 states that limit how teachers can discuss racism in the classroom, labeling it a divisive concept. Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin campaigned on eliminating the instruction of critical race theory in public schools, but the college-level framework, which teaches that the structure of American society is inherently racist, is not taught in K-12 grades in Virginia. Youngkin's first executive order forbids teaching, quote, inherently divisive concepts in the state's public schools. Under Executive Order 1, K-12 curriculum is subject to a compliance review by top education officials in Virginia. The governor even established a short-lived hotline for parents to complain about teachers and lesson plans involving race. Wilson began teaching the state's African American history elective at a high school in Newport News in 2021 under a different political climate. The course was developed in 2020 under former Governor Ralph Northam following the racial reckoning brought by the Black Lives Matter movement in the summer of 2020. Wilson, who is Black, shares how he and his students have been impacted by the backlash against Black history education in Virginia. Wilson has been teaching history in Virginia and North Carolina for 28 years. So, Matthan, we're talking about education here. So tell us about your own education.
I was raised in Portsmouth. I went through Portsmouth Public Schools. After graduating from I.C. Norcom High School in Portsmouth, I went for a year at North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro, North Carolina. I returned home after my freshman year and finished up at Norfolk State University after a stint in the Army. Right out of Norfolk State, I spent a year at Indiana University. I came back, went to the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and finished my master's at Norfolk State.
Can you tell me a bit about what you studied?
I've always been interested in social studies. So at Norfolk State, I got a degree in history. I've always been very interested in the stories. I used to listen to my grandmother tell stories on the porch in Southampton County. And the stories just were so interesting, how people lived at that time and the experiences that they had. So I was always interested in history. So I did my undergraduate in history. I found out there were so many different avenues in history to explore. And I ended up doing urban studies. And I started looking at the urban environment and how people live. And I had a professor at Norfolk State, mentioned his name, Dr. Jesse Pendleton, who got me interested in geography like you wouldn't believe. It really opened up my world when I started listening to the lectures that he had given. And so when I went to my master's program, I started doing urban studies and, again, finished up with a master's in urban affairs.
So why did you choose to teach high schoolers history? You obviously have a passion, but why bring that passion to others?
To spark an interest in, or to spread the love I have for history to younger students, to give students a energetic view of history. History classes, when you're growing up, were always those classes everybody said was so boring. And I thought if I could bring my energy, if I could bring something new to the table and introduce it in a way that students could understand it, and in a way that would make it interesting to them, then maybe I can spark something in someone.
And what was your experience with history education, in particular Black history education, growing up in grades K through 12?
My education in history started in elementary school. And my teacher was describing the founding of America. We were in the early chapters in American history. And the textbook had a picture of the guy, the Puritan, holding an axe and had all of these tree stubs in his field, where it looks as if he had chopped down the trees. And my teacher said the Puritans came over and they cleared the land and they built this great nation. Oh, and we had a Thanksgiving. I'm thinking, wait a minute, who did they have a Thanksgiving with? And then we found out that Native Americans were here, and they were here first. And I'm thinking, so why would the Europeans have to come and clear the land? Because there's two things you have to have when you settle. You have to have a steady food supply, and you must have a steady water supply. And I said, if the Native Americans were here, well, why was this man chopping the trees down? Wouldn't that have already been done? As a second grader, I could not understand. It just did not make sense to me. I said, well, maybe I need to look into this more. My father was a graduate of Norfolk State also. He was an economics major. And he had all his textbooks in our den, on the bookshelf in our den. He had all his and I would pull his textbooks down and I would read the textbooks and say, wait a minute, what? Here I'm a second grader reading college level textbooks going, wait a minute, that teacher didn't tell me the right thing. We need to go back, and to go back in the classroom and say, what you said wasn't right. And then I would get ostracized for, this was the thing of when I went through in Portsmouth was the third year of integration, busing in city of Portsmouth. For us to talk back to a teacher that way meant you got sent out.
So what was your teacher's response? You say ostracized. What would your teacher say?
It's going back. She put me out. She sent me out of the classroom. I remember going home and crying to my mom. And my mom said, what did he do wrong? And she said, well, we're trying to teach a lesson, and he keeps, disrupting the classroom. I became a disruption. And it wasn't just a disruptor. It was an inquisitive kids wondering, what are you telling me? This isn't adding up. It doesn't make sense. I used to question. In second grade, in that classroom, was very difficult for me because I've always been questioning things. And I was made to feel as though I wasn't adequate enough to even ask questions. My second grade teacher told me that African American students cannot read and write as well as white students.
And this was, you said, in the early years of integrated schools.
Early years of integrated schools, or early busing. The schools have been integrated, but busing in different neighborhoods. And we were bused out of our neighborhood of Cavalier Manor into the Hodges Manor neighborhood. And so, you're this fourth grader sitting on these buses, and, it was frightening for me to sit on the bus and go into a neighborhood I had never been in. It was scary. It was very scary. And then again, to be taught lessons that, to me, it didn't make sense. It never made sense.
So you've mentioned you have your bachelor's in history.
Yes.
So when you finally got to college, was it freeing to study history, or were you encountering some of the same bias, some of the same mythology?
My freshman year, I took at North Carolina A&T. And I went into a history class, Dr. Perry, and I went into his history class and sat down and started to repeat the things that I had been taught in history. And I remember, and I'll never forget, he looked at me and he said, "What's wrong with you?" In the middle of like 200 kids. He said, "What are you saying?" And it made me feel like an inch tall. And I said, you know what, I got to start learning more. I really have to start learning more about history. Coming back to Norfolk State, because I left A&T, went into the service, came back to Norfolk State, I just said, I'm going to learn as much as I can. And then I got introduced to certain professors at Norfolk State, which was a godsend. Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander, just phenomenal lady, phenomenal. She would introduce me to books to read. She would tell me about different ideologies in history, and even understanding that a person who write a book in history don't make it accurate, because they're going to have a slant in their ideology just as anybody else would. Dr. Jesse Pendleton, who used to always tell me to investigate, to get into those situations and then to hear the history told from a different perspective, you saw the world differently. It was like a light coming on and shining into that classroom. Things started to make sense. The world started to finally make sense.
You use the phrase seeing the light, but sometimes when you learn more, it can be a bit of a dark experience, learning more about your history, learning more about wrongs. Was there anything that you learned as a Black man in this deep dive into history that really was uncomfortable or upset you or made you angry?
Well, first, when I started studying history, especially African American history, going back to the continent, here's this continent 3.5 times the size of the United States. You can take the continental U.S. and set it inside the Sahara Desert. And we were all called Africans. And it made it seem as if we were this homogenous group. We were just sitting there as this homogenous people waiting to be used as slaves. And it was really an anger moment. They say, wow, these people are smart enough to make a difference. These people can create societies. These people can create states, in the definition of it. When you start to look at that viewpoint, that ideology, yeah, it can make you angry because this is how the world sees you now. And then when you come to the United States and look at it, they group you back again. We're all Black people. We're all African Americans. We can't be distinct. You put all the African American people in this neighborhood, like there's no distinction between African American people. We're not astute enough to say, okay, we're from this area. I'm more Nigerian. I'm Congo. I'm from Angola. I'm from this area, and this is where my heritage lies. We have no clue. No clue. And that's something that's a little dark when you think about it, because that was all taken away.
So bringing the discussion to now, to the course you're teaching on African American history, which was developed under previous Governor Ralph Northam, how does this new course differ from previous Black history instruction in the Commonwealth?
There's this ideology that when you're teaching African American history, that it does become separate. You get very cautious about what you say and what you discuss. One of the things that we always try to tell kids in the very beginning is that there weren't any slaves that were brought from Africa. They always say slaves were brought from Africa. And you would say, well, they weren't slaves. They were architects, engineers, doctors, lawyers, statesmen, warriors that were brought to America and turned into slaves and made slaves. Well, you get kind of nervous saying those kinds of things because that's not the ideology that a lot of people have. And they say, well, no, you're teaching something that's woke. You're trying to teach something that's very different now. That's not history. You're trying to sway kids to believe a certain ideology. And when you teach history, it's all about who you're listening to. Whichever person tells a story is the narrative that it was being told. So when you are telling history, especially history that is not widely known, it's a very frightening ideology because people say, no, you're teaching woke. This isn't true. You have to teach it this way. Those were slaves that came over. Those were 1619. That was the founding of Jamestown and the first slaves. And you say, well, they weren't slaves when they first came over. 1619 they weren't all slaves. Some of them were indentured servants, gained their freedom. So you really stick strictly to the curriculum guide and what they put in the guide. And sometimes at the end of class, you have a student say, well, why didn't you say this? Or why can't we say this? And you sitting there and get with a student with tears in their eyes. You're like, you gotta be careful what we say because people do believe in indoctrination. If you're telling a story that doesn't fit your guidelines, you're going to look at it negatively. You're going to look at it as maybe a child shouldn't be taught this.
Do you think this new course was a step in the right direction as far as wading through the indoctrination to teach the real history? Do you think it was a good effort?
Yes, it's a good effort, but as everything, it still needs more work. Everything needs more work. As new information comes out, as new research is found, it needs to be introduced into the course. Some of it is going to be very uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. I think if you want to really dig deep into history, especially in the early history of America, there's a lot of uncomfortable truths in there.
And we know this course came after the BLM protests in 2020, a time of racial reckoning. What did that tell you about the racial climate? The fact that Virginia's leaders were willing to bring a more open and equitable course on Black history. to the forefront?
The voices of the young people. They made their voices heard. They voted. They literally went in and started to understand the dynamics of how the system works. And they said, we want change. I always think back to the statues in Richmond. And in the city council, we'll have a meeting, we'll do some studies, we'll get this, and to populate this, the young people saying, no, we're going to take the statues down. Well, we'll get a survey, we'll have a council meeting, we're going to, you're not understanding me. Take the statues down. And these kids are really getting into understanding knowledge of who they are. That has to be directed. You're not looking at research that's been peer reviewed. Then students will start to believe things from different aspects that may not be exactly true. So to get a good handle on it, let's open up the textbooks and let's start teaching history from a different perspective. Let's start teaching about Native Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and let's try to see how the melting pot really came together. And I think that the young people's awakeness, and people like to say, well, they're so woke, but that awakeness in the young people, that was something in 2020 that we really need to pay attention to, because these young people are not listening to the stories that we told. They're not believing in the American of Norman Rockwell. They're not looking at that anymore because they know that isn't 100% honest. And these young people, with the information that they have today, with the inception of the internet, they got more information on their phone than what we use to send a man to the moon. They're going to start looking at this information. They're going to say, you know what, this isn't what you're teaching. Same thing that I did when I was a young man, listening to my second grade teacher picking up books that my father had. They got this on the computer. They can just Google it in class while you're telling them. You can say, hey, Betsy Ross created the flag. And they go, no, she didn't.
Educate me. Betsy Ross did not create the flag.
I'm sorry. She did not.
Who did?
I think the story was created by her family later on. It was afterwards. I think it was a mythology. Like a lot of American history, some of it is mythology and made up. And, I was in class one time and we were talking about George Washington and the founding fathers. And one of the students in the classroom said, well, Mr. Wilson, are we really going to talk about the founding fathers? I said, well, excuse me? They said, well, you're saying these are the founding fathers. Well, they wrote this Constitution. I said, yes, indeed, they wrote this Constitution. It's a great document. It's a living document. And one student said, they just copied somebody else. I said, well, they didn't really copy. No, they said, no, they took the words of Locke, and they used Locke's words in this, and they used Locke's words. So they didn't really create it, Mr. Wilson. They sampled it. And I was like, oh, my gosh. I said, okay, how do we address this? This is getting scary. And they would go through it. And the scariest day I remember when we were talking about Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence and the statement, all men are created equal. And they said, well, Mr. Wilson, how did he? She said, all men are created equal. And Thomas Jefferson had slaves. I said, oh my, we going somewhere I can't go. I said, maybe. And it really got nervous because you don't know how parents will accept that. And boy, when the kid pulled up on the website, he said, well, who is Sally Heming? And then another kid said, Sally Heming. I said, oh my gosh, this is getting out of hand. I said, guys, we got to get back to the lesson. And another kid said, Thomas Jefferson was 43, she was 14. I was like, oh Lord, this is getting, because they have access to this information now. So we have to teach this information and kind of instruct ourselves to not leave anybody out. Teach the good and the bad. Teach that there were men of their time, not that they were evil. Just because we're not teaching it, we don't want the kids to look at it and go, he was an evil man. Why we shouldn't even pay attention to Jefferson anymore. No, he was a man of his times. It was a different ideology in a different world. And teach that. Instead of saying, well, let's just hide this part and teach only the good part. Because then you put people on the pedestal so high that when they see something or one kink in that armor, it knocks them completely down.
Can you tell me how maybe some of your students' parents have reacted to your course?
Believe it or not, some parents, when we were doing a course on campus during the pandemic, we've had parents that kind of sat back and were listening to the course. They would come in, they would be there just as a student would, right on time for class. I had this parent that was taking notes. listening to it, asking me about books that they could read and find that information, because a lot of parents are saying, I was never taught this information. I mean, 90% of the Hampton Roads had no idea who the Hidden Figures were till the movie came out. We had no idea that that was happening in Hampton Roads, right here at Langley Air Force Base. We had no idea. So to bring this information out, the parents were just as interested as some of the kids were. You had mentioned the Black Lives Matter movement. When that was going on, that was the scariest thing in the world to talk about, because you had the parents that would say, all lives matter. All lives. And it was hurtful to a lot of kids that, Black Lives Matter. And I said, well, guys, sometimes you got to think of it, put Black Lives Matter too. Because some people may not understand what it is you're saying. Explain it to them. Research it. And when you research it, understand it, then you can explain it. I always say, because if you can explain it to a 6-year-old, you got it. These kids were very upset about it.
How did you handle some of those negative reactions from parents during that time?
Great fear. Handling those reactions, you try to sit down and talk to the parent. Let them see the curriculum. Let them know that the classroom is open. That they can talk to me. I can show them where we're getting information from. Let them see that I'm not trying to indoctrinate the kids. I'm just reporting what's going on. But we want the kids to see it from different perspectives so that the kids can make their own mind up about what they're saying, which is sometimes difficult if you're giving them one side of the story. In my classroom right now, I have 27 kids and 22, excuse me, I'm saying anything of a different period. 22 students in my first period class. When they say the Pledge of Allegiance, only 2 of them stand up to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Everyone else sits down. And a lot of times you ask the kids, well, why don't you stand for the pledge? This is for our country. And they would tell you, Mr. Wilson, they lied to me so much I don't believe in it no more. And that was enormously shocking to me. It was hurtful. It really bothered me. That this is our country, people. We make mistakes. We have to go back and correct mistakes. This is America. America can fall down. We can pick each other up and dust each other off and keep going. The Constitution is a brilliant document which stipulates that we can make changes. They even told you how to make changes for the Constitution. They knew that things were going to happen. That if we stick to a certain basic set of rules, we can all get along. Even though these rules were not extended to everyone, we have now extended them to everyone. Now let's make them work for everyone. And that way you can get the kids to kind of get that energy back, to look back at history as not being this boring subject that I have to pass, as being like, I want to know more about me.
Are there students who have taken it upon themselves to explore Black history outside of the classroom?
What times really stand out to you?
The times that really stand out to me when the kids went into their own initiative is as we went into the civil rights movement. Because the kids were very interested in it because of, again, the George Floyd incident and what's going on. The kids were wondering, why are we still fighting? Why? Why are we still doing this? And they would go back and look at what was done in the civil rights movement, listening to the speeches of Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, Medgar Evers, Stokely Carmichael. The students even went back and looked at the Black Panther Party differently because they were like, this isn't a radical group. This group was feeding people. This group was protecting the neighborhood. They were exercising their constitutional rights. One of the students even brought up the Munford Act.
So this is going beyond what you've
been
teaching.
Well beyond what I've been
Total
doing.
independent research.
Totally independent research. Because it was an incident of an African-American man holding a gun, and they said, and the NRA never said anything, and the kids said, well, had the NRA ever stepped in to help African-American people? And one of the kids brought up the Munford Act in 1967. I was totally shocked.
So drop some knowledge on me. Mumford Act.
1967. These Black Panthers went to the Sacramento State House with rifles. And the Mumford Act was an act written by the California State Legislature to take the rifles out of the courthouse. But they were saying that this act was only written because these African-American men were taking guns in the courthouse. It was not a problem until they came in with the guns. This act, the Mumford Act, was signed by, it was in 1967, it was signed by the governor of California at the time, Ronald Wilson Reagan. He signed legislation to stop guns, to legislate guns in 1967. Has guns been legislated in America? Yes. Well, the legislations have always been enacted when African American people were carrying guns. And the kids were like, okay, why? Why are we still fighting for voting rights? Didn't we get the voting rights in 65? Mr. Wilson, why are we still marching in the street against police brutality? One student came up and asked me about it's a lawsuit right now. There's African American people being charged higher interest rates on home mortgages, even if their credit is better than a white applicant. And they were asking, well, why is that when they had the 1968 Fair Housing Act? Why we have these things? Why we still got to fight for these things? And you can see the frustration in a lot of kids. They do go beyond because they wonder, why is this stuff still happening now? How come no one will listen to us? How come no one wants to hear us? And every time we say something, we're being kicked to the curb. That's more or less their dialect. These kids are different. And it's not just African American students asking that. You have white students asking the same thing. Well, why are we doing this? Why do we still have to do this? This is ancient stuff. As one student said, this is for old people. That's for your generation, Mr. Wilson. That's for old people. You're like, oh my gosh.
Did you hear any interesting solutions for these old but new problems from the students?
Everybody should get along. We should all get along. We should all sit down and talk. We should understand each other. We should have discussions. We should sit down and just talk. One girl said, it's not right, and we should just stop doing it. She said, well, maybe if we did mortgage applications and you don't have to put race on the paper. Educate. You hear kids say that a lot. Educate. Teach kids. How come we don't teach us this stuff? If they taught us this stuff, this will make history interesting. Right now it's boring. And you hear that a lot from the kids.
Political climate right now in regard to teaching about race in the class. And how do you handle that? Do you discuss it?
I listen to the students. I try not to quell their interest when they interest peaks. Sometimes I wish people can hear what these young people are saying. Mr. Wilson, why did they lie to us? Why are we being lied to? Why did they want us to believe this? It's not true. It didn't happen. What is the purpose? What's the end game? Why, you get a lot of this from students, and you like students who you would not think would even ask those types of questions are asking us. Well, one student told me, if they're going to keep lying to me, why am I going to try to learn it? And you're like, no. We have to kind of continue our learning. You should open up to learning. Open up to research. If you hear something, do more research. I always tell my students, research. Let the research be your guide. That was taught to me by Dr. Evelyn Sawyer. She would always say that, let the research be your guide. Let the research be your guide. And I've taught that to my students. Let the research be your guide. Kids today, they want change. They want it happening now. They don't want to wait.
Does that give you faith in young people?
These young people today are incredible. I don't think we give them enough credit because they don't carry themselves the way we do. They don't believe the way we believe. But they're not growing up in the world we grew up in. The world is changing. These kids are strong. They're resilient. They're smart. They are remarkable little people, as we say. I like to call them just remarkable little people. As one of my students told me, they don't fall for the okie doke. Generally, these kids are really opening up their eyes because they're tired. They want to understand police brutality. They want to understand, why is it happening today? And these aren't just, quote unquote, African American kids. These are students from all ethnic backgrounds that are just saying, this isn't right. And they're starting to see things very differently. And as the demographics of America change, and they are changing rapidly, we're going to see a lot of different things happen in our lifetime. Hopefully for the better. Hopefully with a better understanding of the founding principles, the Constitution, and what they meant by all men are created equal. We're going to get a better understanding of what it means for us to acknowledge the rights of others, to be your fellow man. And the kids was, stand up and say, wait, this is something worth fighting for. This is something worth defending. I'm a part of this. This is part of me now. I'm an American, and I can stand up as an American because this country represents me and respects me.
You had mentioned earlier that many students didn't even stand for the pledge. Did you have anyone change their feelings about that as the year went on?
One student, I can't say his name, but he did. He had spoken to me about joining the military. And I spoke to him because I was in the Army. And I spoke to him about my experience. And he asked me, why did I join the Army? And I said, because I'm an American and our country has to be defended. And I volunteered to do so and would do so immediately again if I could. But at my age with these bones right now, I wouldn't be much of a defense for America right now. But he started to understood that even with its imperfections, America's still beautiful. You don't throw away a Rolls Royce because it got a scratch in it. You go out and you fix it. You work on it. And he said he wanted to be part of the solution. These young people are getting into it if they understand the full story as best we can, because there's no way in the world you can tell every aspect from every perspective. But if we can just get an ideology of how we can teach our kids that man standing beside you, the woman standing beside you, I don't care how they dress, I don't care how they look, I don't care what their beliefs are, that person is an American just like you, and we're going to stand together, then we can change things, and we can make America better. It's not perfect. We will make it better. And we're going to understand and learn, and then we'll get them to learn more about America, to understand why we can make it better or how we can make it better. But we have to get them to see each other as equals, to understand each other, to respect each other.
As a society, what's lost when we don't know our complete history?
What's the old saying? When you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. We will run in a circle. Understanding your mistakes makes you a better person. If you truly understand your mistakes, you truly take responsibility for your actions and your mistakes, you'll be a better person. Because you say, I made that mistake. I messed up, which means I can change it. And if I can change it, I can control my destiny. And if we as a country, we can control our destiny. This is a great country, but we can't cherry pick what we teach kids so it could be something that we enjoy. We can't teach kids that we did not make mistakes. We messed up. Let's take our mistakes, fess up to them, as the kids say. Let's make this a better country. I think that'd be the best thing that we could probably do.